The blue flame. That's the first thing. Oxygen and acetylene meeting at the tip of a comet torch, the cone settling from soft orange to a hard, hissing blue, and the smell of scorched steel that every Australian tradesman knows in his sleep. The torch is blue and white, stamped down the side, one word, Cigweld, made in Australia. For most of a century, this was the company that armed the country, the electrodes that built the warships, the gear that wired the Snowy, the welders in every workshop from Kalgoorlie to Cairns. 700 people at the peak, in a factory in Preston, Melbourne. Today, that factory runs a skeleton crew of about 64. The torch is still on the shelf. The steel inside comes from a Chinese city called Ningbo, and the company was sold to foreigners 3 times. So how does a nation forget how to weld? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The 2 workshops. The strange thing about the man who started it is how little of him survives. John B. Arnold founded his business in Melbourne on June 1st, 1922. A small operation making gas welding and spray painting equipment. The shop that would give Australia the comet torch. And that is very nearly all we can say for certain about him. No photograph in wide circulation. No obituary anyone has dug up. No diary, no biography, no grandchildren doing the rounds of the newspapers. The founder of a national industry, and the record has almost swallowed him whole. Hold that thought, because by the end of this story, it will start to feel less like an accident and more like a pattern. What we do have is the work. Arnold's firm sat in Carlton and West Melbourne, turning out the torches and regulators that let a man cut and join steel with a bottle of oxygen and a bottle of acetylene. And a year later, in 1923, a second workshop opened its doors, EMF Electric, electromagnetic force. They built the other half of the trade, arc welding transformers, spot welders, and the coated electrodes a welder burns down by the thousand. 2 separate companies, 2 halves of a single craft, and for more than a decade they had no idea they'd end up as one thing. Here's the thing about Australian welding in the 1920s. It was being invented in real time by immigrants and tinkerers in sheds. One of them was a Scot named Alexander Anderson Stewart, born in Aberdeen in 1874. A ship's engineer who'd come out to Victoria in 1898 and gone into the oxygen and acetylene business with a fellow Scot named William Fyvie when almost nobody in the country understood what it was for. Another was Russell Grimwade, who stood up in front of the Victorian Institute of Engineers back in 1909 and demonstrated oxyacetylene welding to a room of men who had grown up with rivets and forges and open flame. These were the people building the ground the industry would stand on, decades before it had a name the public would know. And in 1928, EMF did something that tells you exactly what kind of industry this was. It opened a welding school in an old cable tram shed on Rathdown Street, North Carlton, and it trained unemployed men to be boilermaker welders, for free. With the backing of the Trades Hall, in the teeth of the Depression, a company teaching men a trade for nothing, because the country was going to need welders and because a man with a trade in his hands is a man who can feed a family. It had no idea how badly the country would need them, because the war was coming and welding was about to become a matter of national survival. Chapter 2. The country that taught itself to weld. In 1935, the pieces came together. Commonwealth Industrial Gases, CIG, was formed, with Alexander Anderson Stewart as its inaugural chairman. He'd be knighted 2 years later in 1937. CIG pulled the scattered industry into one orbit. It had already taken in Arnold's firm, and in 1937, some records say 1939, it acquired EMF as well. The torch makers and the electrode makers, the flame and the arc, finally under one roof. Then, on the other side of the world, the war began, and it reached down and grabbed this small Australian industry by the collar. When Singapore fell in February 1942 and the Japanese came south, Australia discovered a terrifying thing about itself. It was on its own, and it could not import its way out of trouble. Everything it needed, it now had to make. And you cannot build a ship, an aircraft, a gun, or a tank without welders. And you cannot make welders appear out of thin air. So CIG went to war. The company established an electrode factory in Sydney to keep the ARC burning through the emergency. It trained hundreds of welders for defence work, the same instinct as that cable tram shed in North Carlton, now scaled up for the survival of the country. Its engineers developed a technique to flash weld anchor chains for the Royal Australian Navy. Working with the RAAF, they redesigned the British-made oxygen-breathing equipment that aircrews depended on in the thin, freezing air early in the war. Ted Raymond, E.J. Raymond, who had joined the oxygen business back in 1913 and risen to become CYG's chief technical officer, had told a Sydney conference in 1939 that it was somewhat surprising welding had advanced as far as it had. Within 3 years, it had to advance a great deal further and fast. The company's own official history would later carry a chapter with a title that says it all: The Welders at War. And they were everywhere the war was being built. Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour became the main ship repair base for the entire South Pacific after Singapore was gone, building 19 new ships and repairing more than 40 Allied warships. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation at Fisherman's Bend turned out Wirraways, Boomerangs, Beauforts. Melbourne became the arsenal of the country. In 1939, 89% of the munitions industry's workforce was in Victoria, and even at the 1943 peak, when that industry employed some 60,000 people nationally, a third of them were still Victorians. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this story is built on it. No document I've found says in plain words that a Cigweld torch cut the steel at Cockatoo Island, or that CIG electrodes joined the frames at Fisherman's Bend. But CIG had a near monopoly on industrial gas and welding gear in this country. When Australia welded itself through the war, it welded with what this company made. That is not a leap. That is arithmetic. And when the war was won, the welders didn't stop. Australia's first all-welded warship, HMAS Voyager, slid into the water in 1952, after the war, not during it, but built on everything the war had taught. And from 1949, the same welding know-how went up into the mountains for the Snowy Scheme, the biggest engineering project the country had ever dared. The empire that armed the nation was about to gather itself into one place. And that place was Preston. Chapter 3. Preston. In 1962, CIG pulled its scattered Melbourne workshops together and moved them onto a single site in Preston, in Melbourne's inner north, the Equipment Division, Arnold's old Carlton and West Melbourne plants. EMF's ARC equipment works in North Carlton, the electrode and wire operation from Abbotsford, all of it consolidated onto one industrial footprint, one address that would carry the whole story from here to the end. Gower Street, Preston. And what came off those lines became the furniture of Australian working life. The Comet torch had already gone through its generations. The Comet won in 1957, brass-handled and heavy and honest in the hand. The Comet 2 in 1967, the Comet 3 in 1975, there were the Saturn-craft electrodes, the 6013, the general-purpose stick that a whole country learned to weld on, the one an apprentice ran first. Ferrocraft for the heavy structural work, Saturn chrome for stainless, the transmig machines for serious industrial MIG welding. Later, the weld skill range for the shed and the farm and the weekend. If you have ever stood in a country machinery shed or a suburban garage or a technical college workshop, you have seen this gear. The blue and white. It was simply there, the way the Hills hoist was there, the way the Victor was there, an object so woven into the ordinary that nobody ever thought to photograph it. It was too common to be precious. That's how you know something matters in Australia. Nobody takes a picture of it until it's gone. Preston, in these decades, was a migrant suburb, and so was the whole belt of factories around it. This was the Australia the post-war immigration program built. Men who had come off the boats from southern Europe, from Italy and Greece and Malta and the former Yugoslavia, and found work on the factory floors of Melbourne's north. I can't hand you the name of a specific Cigweld welder from 1965 and tell you what he thought as he clocked on. That testimony hasn't survived, and I'm not going to invent it for you. But I can tell you the shape of that world with total confidence. A wage you could raise a family on. A weatherboard house within driving distance of the plant. A trade in your hands that meant something at any gate in the country. That was the deal, and for a long time the deal held. Here's the thing about a factory like this. It isn't just making torches, it's making a middle class. Every apprentice who came through, every fitter and turner and boilermaker who drew a Cigweld wage and bought a car and put kids through school, was a small piece of the same machine. The machine that turned a raw, isolated country into one that could build its own things and defend its own coast. By the middle of the 1980s, that machine had a new name stamped across the front gate. And it was the biggest of its kind in the country, the largest of them all. Chapter 4, The Blue and White Empire. In 1985, CIG's equipment division was given the name the whole country would come to know, Cigweld. And this is the top of the mountain. At its formation, Cigweld was, in the company's own words, the largest Australian manufacturer of welding machines, gas equipment, filler metals, and safety products. Full stop. Not one of the largest. The largest. It employed 700 people in Australia and another 120 across the water in the Philippines. 700. Hold on to that number. Everything that happens from here is measured against it. Picture what 700 people making welding gear actually looks like. The electrode lines running hot, extruding and baking the flux onto steel rod by the ton. The ovens driving the moisture out so the weld won't crack. The torch shop machining brass to the 1,000th. The gas equipment benches. The wire drawing. The dispatch dock loading pallets of blue and white product onto trucks bound for every state in the country. A comet torch coming off the Preston line in 1985 was an Australian object from end to end. Australian steel, Australian brass, Australian hands, Australian design. And it went into the grip of an Australian tradesman who would keep it for 30 years and hand it to his apprentice like an heirloom. The State Library of New South Wales holds a press photograph dated the 22nd of November 1963 of a CIG Comet Junior welder sitting beside its oxygen cylinders. A small, ordinary picture of a small, ordinary machine that a nation ran on. And the blue and white was everywhere. The company did heavy work. On the mine sites of the Pilbara, in the railway workshops, on the wheat belt farms where a man had to fix his own header 100 kilometres from the nearest town and couldn't wait a week for a part, in the naval dockyards. In every technical college, teaching the next generation the trade their fathers had. This was market dominance of a kind that is almost impossible now to imagine. A single Australian brand that owned its category, made everything it sold on home soil, and had done, in one form or another, for 60 years. It was not competing with the world. It was the standard the world was measured against, at least on this island. But every empire has a cost, and this one was breathed in rather than counted. Because the thing about welding, the thing nobody on those lines was talking about in 1985, the thing that didn't make the annual report, is what comes off the arc. The plume, the fume, the bright, hard light and the fine metal smoke that rises off molten steel and burning flux and hangs in the air of a workshop. Every welder in that factory breathed it. Every welder in every shed that bought the product breathed it. And nobody at that point was counting the cost. Chapter 5. What the fumes did. Here's the problem with a welding empire. The product is dangerous to make and dangerous to use, and for most of the 20th century, the danger was simply the price of the job, accepted, unmeasured, breathed in 8 hours a day for 40 years. Welding fume is a stew of metal oxides thrown off the arc. And in March 2017, a working group of 17 scientists from 10 countries met in Lyon, France, under the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and reclassified the entire category. Welding fume was moved up to Group 1, a definite human carcinogen. Not possibly, not probably, definitely. The finding was published in the medical journal The Lancet Oncology on the 10th of April 2017. Before that, since 1989, it had sat in the softer bracket, possibly carcinogenic to humans. For nearly 30 years, the science had hedged. Then it stopped hedging, and it confirmed what the men on the lines had lived inside all along. And it isn't only cancer. The manganese in welding fume attacks the nervous system. Long-term exposure is linked to a Parkinson's-like neurological condition doctors call manganism, a slow robbing of a man's movement and speech. The chromium that comes off stainless steel welding, hexavalent chromium, is its own confirmed carcinogen, the same compound that made a small California town famous. Read that again. The people who built the country's steel breathed a Group 1 carcinogen to do it, and the country didn't formally acknowledge how much was too much until January 2024, when Australia's workplace safety ministers finally slashed the exposure standard for welding fume by 80%. From 5 milligrams per cubic metre down to 1. That is not ancient history. That is the year before last. For the entire golden age of Cigweld, the whole peak, the 700, the 60 years of dominance, the accepted limit, was 5 times what it is today. Now, I have to be straight with you, because this story lives and dies on getting it right. I've found no court case, no compensation ruling naming Cigweld and a poisoned worker. I am not going to stand here and invent one for the sake of a scene. What I can tell you is documented, and it is enough. Cigweld's own safety data sheets today carry the Group 1 carcinogen warning on the fume their products create. The hazard is real. It is admitted in black and white, and it was in the lungs of every person who worked that trade through the long decades when nobody thought to measure it. On the factory floor, the union in the room was the National Union of Workers, the NUW, which held the enterprise agreement at Cigweld's Preston plant. That was the organisation standing between the men and the worst of it, the way unions had stood on Australian factory floors since the industry began. But while Australians were breathing the fume to make the electrodes, something was happening in the offices above the floor. The men who owned the company were getting ready to sell it, and once that started, it would not stop, not for one owner, not for two, not for 30 years. Chapter 6. The Last Australian Owners. In 1989, the first hand let go of the rope. CIG's ultimate parent, by this point, was the British Oxygen Company, BOC, and BOC made a decision that looked entirely sensible on a spreadsheet in London. It wanted to focus on its core business, which was industrial gas, welding equipment, filler metals, torches. That was not the core. It was a distraction from the main game. So BOC divested Cigweld. It sold the business off to a group called the Cigweld Group, a consortium of the company's own senior managers together with 2 investment companies. On paper, this was a management buyout, the people who ran the place, buying the place. And for a few years, that is exactly what it was. the last era in which Cigweld, this 70-year-old Australian institution, the largest welding manufacturer in the country, the company that had armed a world war, was owned by Australians. I would love to tell you who those managers were, which of them mortgaged the family house to buy a piece of the company they'd given their working lives to, what they hoped to build. But the record doesn't name them. The individual members of that consortium aren't there in any public source I can find. Another set of Australians written out of their own story, the same way John Arnold was written out of his 60 years earlier. This industry keeps losing its own people. What matters is the structure of the moment, because it repeats all through Australian manufacturing in these years, over and over, in company after company. A big foreign parent decides a perfectly good local business is no longer core. It sells that business to local buyers. And that sale, however well-intentioned it is, however much it looks like Australians taking back control of something, is really only the first move in a longer game. Because a management consortium standing on the money of two investment companies is not a family that will hold the thing for 100 years and pass it to a grandchild. It is, by its nature, a temporary owner. It is a business that now exists, quietly, to be sold again at the right price to the right buyer when the moment comes. And think about the Australia this was happening in. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating had floated the dollar in 1983 and were methodically tearing down the tariff walls that had protected local manufacturing for 2 full generations. The entire spirit of the age was that protection had been a crutch, that Australian industry had to sink or swim in the open ocean of global competition. A great many good Australian companies, suddenly stripped of their shelter, became exactly what Cigweld had become, an asset, looking for a buyer, in a market where the buyers increasingly spoke with foreign accents and thought in foreign currencies. Cigweld didn't have to wait long at all. 7 years after the Australians took it on, a company from St. Louis, Missouri, came and bought the lot. Chapter 7. St. Louis. Its name was Thermadyne. Thermadyne Holdings Corporation was an American welding and cutting conglomerate out of St. Louis, Missouri, founded in 1987 by a financier named James N. Mills, put together through the acquisition of a company called Palco Industries, and built up into a stable of brands: Victor, Studi, Twaco, Thermal Dynamics, some of them with roots running back to 1913. It was, in other words, a company assembled the modern way, not grown from one shed by one obsessive with an idea. Bought together piece by piece by men who understood a balance sheet far better than they would ever understand a weld. In 1996, Thermadyne bought Cigweld, and it did it the way these deals are always done, not by buying Cigweld off a shelf, but by buying the Australian holding company that owned it, an entity called Duxtec Proprietary Limited. The share sale agreement was signed in November 1995 and took effect on the 1st of February 1996. And here is the number that matters, the one almost everybody gets wrong. The total consideration was around $74 million, of which roughly $21.5 million was debt that Thermadyne simply took on. $74 million. Write it down. Keep it somewhere. Because in a few minutes I am going to show you what this same company was worth 18 years later. And the distance between those two numbers is the entire story of what happened to Australian manufacturing in one line. For now, the 700 were still there. The Preston lines were still running hot. A Cigweld electrode in 1997 was still an Australian electrode, made by Australian hands. From the factory floor, an American parent in St. Louis was a distant and abstract thing, a name on a letterhead, a new logo in the annual report, a directive that came down through management. The torch in a tradesman's hand was still blue and white. The work was still the work. The country still made its own. But the new owner had troubles of its own. In 2001, Thermadyne filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. Bankruptcy court in Missouri, buckling under exactly the kind of debt that these acquisition-built companies always seem to end up carrying. It emerged in May 2003, restructured, with its long-term debt slashed, under a chief executive named Carl Weiss, who talked in the language these men always use, about being well positioned to grow the market-leading brands. An Australian institution that had survived the Depression and armed a world war was now a subsidiary of an American company that had just climbed, blinking, out of bankruptcy court. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Because in 2005, Thermadyne looked hard at its Australian factory and its Australian wages and its Australian safety standards, and it found a cheaper place to make things. Chapter 8. Ningbo. The place was called Ningbo, a port city on the east coast of China, just south of Shanghai. In 2005, Thermadyne, with Cigweld now sitting inside it, established a gas equipment manufacturing facility in Ningbo, along with a wholly foreign-owned enterprise and a sales office in Shanghai. And this is the moment, not a press conference, not a factory gate chained shut in front of the cameras, not a single dramatic day you could circle on a calendar and mourn. Just a decision, made in an American boardroom, to begin building in China what had been built in Preston since 1962. I want to be precise about this because it's the beating heart of the whole story, and it is the one thing the headline gets slightly wrong. The offshoring of Cigweld did not begin with the Swedish-descended company whose name is on this video. It began right here in 2005, under the Americans at Thermadyne. This is where the manufacturing started to leave the country. Quietly, a line at a time, a component sourced from Ningbo instead of made at Preston, then another component, then a whole product family. The way a tide goes out, you don't see it move if you stare at it. You only see that the water is gone. And it was happening inside a much bigger current that was pulling all of Australian manufacturing out to sea at once. The tariff walls were down, the dollar floated, and on the far side of the world, China was becoming the workshop of the entire planet. Chinese welding consumable makers, companies like Atlantic China Welding, and the big Shandong and Qingdao producers with electrode capacity measured in the hundreds of thousands of tons a year, could make a stick electrode for a fraction of what it cost to make the same electrode in Melbourne. You cannot pay an Australian wage, meet an Australian safety standard and beat a price like that. Nobody can. It is not a failure of effort. It is arithmetic. Again, the same cold arithmetic, running the other way this time. So the comet torch changed. Slowly at first, and then not so slowly. The blue and white stayed exactly the same. The name on the box stayed exactly the same. But the tips, the internals, the consumable steel, those started coming from Ningbo. The very same object a tradesman had trusted his entire working life, still sitting on the shelf at the trade counter looking identical, was quietly becoming something assembled from imported parts. Same face, different bones. Let that number sit for a moment, the 700, because from 2005 the 700 began to fall. Not in one great redundancy notice you could point to and rage against and hold a rally over. In a slow bleed, a line closed here, a function moved offshore there, the steady, undramatic, almost invisible draining of a factory that had employed a suburb. And then the financiers arrived, and the price of Cigweld exploded. Chapter 9, 74 to 947. Here is where you watch a 100-year-old company become a poker chip. In 2010, a New York private equity firm called Irving Place Capital bought Thermadyne, Cigweld and all, and took it private. The deal was announced on the 5th of October 2010 and completed that December after the shareholders voted it through. The price was around $422 million US, $15 a share, an 18% premium over where the stock had been trading. The men doing the deal had names: Douglas Corn at Irving Place, a chief executive named Martin Quinn, a new executive chairman named Mike McLean. Now remember the $74 million that St. Louis paid in 1996? 14 years on, the same underlying business changed hands for $422. And private equity does not buy a company in order to keep it. It buys to sell. That is the whole model, stated plainly. In 2012, Thermadyne was renamed Victor Technologies, a fresh coat of paint, a new name on the asset to make it shine for the next buyer. And then, on the 12th of February 2014, Irving Place Capital sold Victor Technologies to a company called Colfax Corporation. Total consideration, including debt, $947.3 million US. The deal closed that April. Colfax's chief executive, Steve Sims, called it an exciting combination. Read that again, slowly. $74 million in 1996, $947 million in 2014. The company became more than 12 times more valuable to the men who traded it back and forth. And the Australian workforce that had once stood 700 strong went the other way the entire time. The value went up. The jobs went down. That is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck. That is the mechanism itself. Every dollar the financiers extracted was, in the end, a dollar that did not get spent on a welder in Preston. Irving Place Capital had bought at $422 and sold at $947 in a little over 3 years, better than doubling their money on a company that made torches for Australian tradesmen. Colfax folded Victor and Cigweld inside it into its welding arm, which it ran under a brand called ESAB. And here is the irony that sits at the dead centre of everything. ESAB is Swedish by origin. Elektriska Svetsnings Aktiebolaget, founded in Gothenburg in 1904 by a man named Oskar Kjellberg, who invented the world's first coated welding electrode. The coated electrode. The very thing Cigweld's Australian lines had been extruding and baking by the ton for 60 years. In 2022, Colfax, by then renamed Inovis, spun ESAB off as its own company, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, led by a chief executive named Sham Kambianda, with the financier Mitchell Rales as chairman. The man who invented the coated electrode in Sweden in 1904 now, through the long machinery of global capital, owned the Australian one. The circle had closed, and Australia was on the outside of it. So walk with me into the Preston plant today. Chapter 10. What remains? Stand outside 71 Gower Street, Preston, in 2026. The sign still says Cigweld, Cigweld, an ESAB brand. The doors are open. This is not a demolished site, not a weed-cracked car park, not a story that ends with a padlock and a for-lease board. And that, in its own quiet way, is the strangest ending of all. Because the factory is still here. It's just mostly hollow. What still happens on this site is niche and small. The assembly of Cigweld medical products, the oxygen resuscitators, the suction units, the regulators, a modest survivor of the old gas business, keeping a light on. The best estimates put the workforce here at around 64 people. Some data brokers say a little more, some say fewer, and I'll be honest with you that the exact figure is contested and hard to pin down. But every number that exists is a fraction of what once was. 700 at the peak. Around 64 now. There is no plaque. Nothing on the fence at Gower Street tells you that this was once the largest welding manufacturer in the entire country. Nothing tells you the gear made on this ground armed a world war, or wired the Snowy, or that 100 years of Australian industrial life ran straight through this address. You would drive past it on the way to somewhere else and never know a thing. The Comet torch is still on the shelf at the trade counter. The blue and white is unchanged, right down to the colour. The weld skill machines are still there for the bloke doing up his ute on a Saturday. But the entry-level machines are made in China now, and the torch tips come from Ningbo. And Cigweld today is, in truth, a name and a distribution network wrapped around product made across ESAB's global factories: China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, the United States. The brand is alive and well. The empire is gone. Those are two completely different things, and the gap between them is precisely where the country's manufacturing went. And here is the last of it, the part that should keep you up. Australia is now, by the reckoning of its own welding industry body, heading for a shortage of around 70,000 welders by the year 2030. Manufacturing has fallen to roughly 5% of the whole economy, near the lowest share it has ever been in the nation's history. The country that taught itself to weld in a borrowed cable tram shed in the depths of the Depression, that flash welded the Navy's anchor chains when the Japanese came south, that sent its welders up into the mountains to wire the snowy. That country now buys its welding back in a box off the deck of a ship. So picture it one more time. A tradesman somewhere in Australia this very afternoon lights a comet torch. The oxygen hisses. The flame settles from soft orange down to that same hard, familiar, hissing blue his old man would have known. The handle still says Cigweld, made, it once said, in Australia. The steel inside came from Ningbo. And the man holding it has no idea and no earthly reason to know that the small blue flame in his hand is very nearly the last thing still burning of an empire his grandfather helped to build.